Welcome to an emergency edition of The Grumpy Strategist. I'm Michael Shoebridge and I'm here with my Strategic Analysis Australia colleague, Marcus Hellier. Marcus, hello.
Hello. Yes, I think today's episode is an urgent intervention episode of The Grumpy Strategist, and I think there will be quite a lot of grumping going on.
Yes, I haven't got a sound effect, but the dive.
Red alert,
dive.
red alert.
The government and the Department of Defence have got a proposed new bill that they want to get into law rapidly called the Defence Trade Controls Amendment Bill 2023. And submissions about what's in this bill close the 17th of November.
Yes, there was a vanishingly small window of opportunity to make a submission on this proposed bill.
I think submissions opened
last week and closed this week.
Yeah, so there were 8 working days, and there's 44 pages in what is, I think, amusingly called the explanatory memorandum for the bill.
Yes, I would have to say that is one of the least accurate descriptions I have ever seen. It explains nothing, though there is one very clear paragraph in there that we will get to.
Now, why does this matter and why are we doing an emergency podcast? Well, the simple answer is this legislation controls everything about how companies and researchers go about researching, sharing information, cooperating, and producing items of military use and things that have a dual commercial and potential military use. And the things that are controlled on the current list under the current version of this law are quite extensive. So, Marcus, for the people that haven't immersed themselves in this bill and the list, what kinds of things are on the list already?
Well, so the list is the Defence and Strategic Goods List, the DSGL. And this is a list of military items that you can't export without a permit. But there is also a second chunk to that list, an even longer chunk, which is so-called dual-use items. So things that are used in everyday civilian usage, but potentially also have a military usage. So, and the export of these things is controlled. And, that's a good thing. Australia has a robust export regime.
Yep.
But so what this bill does is 2 things. So first of all, it, quote, removes the requirement to obtain a permit for supplies of certain DSGL goods and technology and the provision of certain DSGL services to the United Kingdom or the US. So in a sense, you might say this is AUKUS nirvana. There are now no restrictions around the exchange of information and things with the US and the UK.
Wow, well that's fantastic, isn't it? Isn't that this harmonisation of the 3 countries' ecosystems that the bureaucrats have been pursuing? So this looks like victory. What's the problem that comes with this?
But it also regulates the supply of certain goods or services to any other country or nationals of any other country, including within Australia, and including what happens to those goods or information once they leave Australia. So you go, but isn't that a good thing? Well, sort of, because to get back to your original question, what is actually on the DSGL list? Well, certainly there's really scary things like guided weapons and submarines and those sorts of things.
Military aircraft.
But there's just very basic stuff on there, like rifles. So any rifle made since, I think, 1938 is on that list. So if you take the legislation at its word, an Australian commits a crime if they provide DSGL services in the form of assistance, including training, to foreign persons, whether in Australia or abroad, in the design, development, engineering, manufacture, production, assembly, testing, repair, maintenance, modification, operation, etc., of DSGL goods and technology without a permit. So if we actually follow this, if an Australian provides information or training to another national, not a US or UK national, on how to maintain a rifle, how to repair a rifle, they have now broken the law.
So presumably, if you're an Olympic shooting coach and you're Australian, but you happen to want to coach the Japanese team, you'll need a permit.
Well, that's a good question. And that's, I think, what everybody is wondering, because in places it says it regulates the supply of certain military dual-use technology.
It's services as well.
But then the word certain disappears. So does it now, by default, include everything on that list, or is there a kind of mini list of the really important stuff like nuclear powered submarines? And so there are just so many questions around this. But if you're an Australian or an Australian company, you would be very hesitant to work with anybody who is not Australian, US or UK because the likelihood of sharing something is very high.
Well, so here's an interesting question then. You work for a company called Thales. You don't, but let's say Person X, our good friend Ralph, works for Thales here in Australia, and he's or she has been developing sonar, cooperating with people back in a place called France. Well, presumably that's bad news now, so it's permit time for that.
Yeah, and you might go, well, sonars are high-tech, you want to protect that. You go, okay, but Thales also makes explosives. And explosives are on the list. So does that mean a Thales employee in Australia can't work with a Thales employee who's French on basic explosives?
Well, they also make control systems that have military and civilian dual use. So they're doing air traffic control systems for defence and for the civil authorities here in Australia. They make control systems for transport systems. You just think to yourself, where are the boundaries on this? But if I could just... We've had controls for a long time. The big new thing here, though, is Australia has never had the strict and deeply problematic ITAR system operating domestically. And to me, that's what this is actually doing. It's saying, because of AUKUS, we are now going to live in the US ITAR world.
Okay, so ITAR is the US International Traffic in Arms Regulation. Yeah. So that is, many people would argue, the dead hand sitting on top of US innovation. And there are many, many people, including in the US, who say one of the biggest problems the US is facing in terms of innovation is the impact of ITAR. But what's really interesting is probably the clearest passage in this rather opaque explanatory memorandum says, the purpose of this bill is to strengthen Australia's export control framework in order to establish an export control regime that is comparable to the one the United States administers. So essentially what we've consciously done is decided to take a system that pretty much everybody says is broken, including the people who live inside that system.
The owners of the system.
And we're going to adopt it. So what we seem to be saying is the US arms control system is broken, but if we somehow get inside it by completely copying it, it'll be okay. The only issue is the price we have to pay is we can't really work with anybody else.
Well, one thing immediately out of this is the idea that Japan or South Korea might be in AUKUS has been raised, and before this, I had said, well, we should make sure AUKUS is working and has delivered some things first before we try and expand the members. But frankly, with this new approach to our law around regulation of who we can and can't work with and who needs a permit to have a conversation or inadvertently be at a conference where there's a Japanese colleague or a South Korean colleague, the case for having these close partners join AUKUS immediately seems to me to be made.
But why would the South Koreans do it? We've got this great export
industry. They're probably not
industry.
that stupid, are they?
Well, we're exporting all kinds of stuff around the world. We want to take your stupid system?
Yeah, well, look, here's a funny thought. So there's a company called Boeing Australia, and they've developed something that the Australian Defence Organisation and the current government, in fact, the previous government, celebrate as a wonderful agile, fast success. It's something called Ghost Bat. It's a small, uncrewed aerial vehicle. It was originally called Loyal Wingman.
Quite large, but,
Well, yeah, but it was developed in Australia by Boeing deliberately to avoid what I think they themselves called ITAR entanglement, contamination with ITAR controls which would limit cooperation that would not enable that rapid development. So even a big US defence prime like Boeing saw the need to escape the dead hand of ITAR to do something agile, innovative and fast.
Yes. Well, I know some of our listeners might be saying, well, Marcus and Michael are just two grumpy old guys who don't know what they're talking about. So I'll quote somebody who actually does know what they're talking about. This is Bill Greenwald, former US Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Industrial Policy and one of America's foremost experts on arms export laws and regulations. So he is actually a world expert on
an
this
acknowledged
subject.
world expert. Yes.
Has run this system and has since written many, many things saying how this system is broken, and in fact has argued very explicitly if you want AUKUS to work, you actually have to reform the US arms control
so I would
system,
think if
not copy it.
If this bill gets reviewed by our parliament, they need to get this other Bill Greenwald, in to talk to them.
Yes, and here's what he'll say, quote, "It looks like Australia just gave up its sovereignty and got nothing for it. It appears that the Australians adopted the US export control system lock, stock and barrel, and everything I wrote about the 8 deadly sins of ITAR will now apply to Australian innovation. I think they just put themselves back 50 years." That's quoting from a piece by Colin Clark.
And we'll put a link to that in the podcast.
And we'll put links also to the so-called explanatory memorandum.
So the 8 deadly
this
sins.
This is a guy who understands the system, has run the system, has basically said this is a really, really dumb thing to do.
So what are the 8 deadly sins in ITAR, which will now become shared sins that Australia is committing?
Okay, well, the 8 deadly sins, so Bill Greenwald wrote these in a piece published by the US Study Centre at the University of Sydney, and I'd say that also that is a place that are huge fans of AUKUS, huge advocates of AUKUS, so they're not just chucking rocks at AUKUS for the sake of it. So the 8 deadly sins of ITAR. Number 1 is outdated mindset. So it's this fossilized relic that we seem to be wanting to impose on our own system.
I worked on this. I was the division head that put the last amendments through Parliament on this Act, and I also negotiated the Australia-US Defence Trade Treaty. So I'm not as expert as Bill because I haven't spent my life doing it, but I've spent a considerable chunk of my time doing it. Mm-hmm. And the outmoded mindset comes from it takes 4 years to get something on the control list. It's a consensus thing with the international community that's part of it. It means it's always a backward-looking list by definition.
But to me, the bigger mindset is we are trying to break down barriers to entry for new players in this space. If you want technological innovation, you've got to get new players into this space. This whole approach is about creating bigger barriers to entry.
Well, I think that is a fundamental design issue with this approach and this legislation, because why did AUKUS Pillar 2 come into being? It came into being because technologies like artificial intelligence, cyber, uncrewed systems, big data analysis, quantum, technologies that have been developed in the civilian world, and a bunch of them, AI, cyber, they have proliferated, and drones have proliferated in the civilian world. But because of the barriers to doing business with our militaries, not just in Australia, but in the US and the UK, those applied technologies have not found their way into our militaries. And a big barrier to entry in the US is ITAR. So you're right, we are creating larger barriers to make sure that Pillar 2 can't happen, because the problem that we already have, we are going to double down on.
So we are voluntarily adopting a mindset that the US itself has recognized doesn't work, but there is such institutionalized inertia behind it, they can't break it down. So number 2 is universality and non-materiality, which essentially is saying of those thousands and thousands of items on the DGSL, it applies to all of them, regardless of what they are, even if they're rifle designs that are now 80 years old.
And how material it might be.
How material is that?
Well, in fact, that brings me to something about the draft law, which is the liability. The offences, most of the offences are strict liability offences. So it doesn't matter what your motives were, what you knew or what you didn't know. It's just, did that happen?
Yeah.
Did you talk to a Japanese person on this topic? Or were they at the conference you're at and you spoke? Yes. Well, you are going to jail for 10 years. These offences have prison terms of 10 years.
Those are sins 3 and 4, extraterritoriality and non-discrimination. So it doesn't discriminate between, how important that technology was. And it also now applies with extraterritoriality. So that means if I have a conversation with, let's say, a Japanese person, and that was okay, I had a permit for that, but they then go home and they spread that information, I'm now liable for that, for something that occurs outside of Australia. So I need perfect knowledge of the future, and that's cardinal sin number 8 here of unwarranted predictability. So it assumes we can predict what's going to happen in the future.
Well, you also need perfect knowledge of those you're interacting with. So you go to what's meant to be the Hunter Defence Conference, you're speaking to a room full of 200 people. What if one of them is not an Australian, UK or US citizen? You have to check all their paperwork before you open your mouth.
Well, I think that gets us to concerns raised by the president of the Australian Academy of Science, Chenapati Jagadish, who raised this exact problem. So it says I can collaborate freely with the US and the UK, which certainly has its benefits, but I would require an approved permit prior to collaborating with other foreign nationals. Without it, my collaborations would see me jailed. And so I think it just puts this dead hand now on Australians' willingness to collaborate with people. So interestingly, the explanatory memorandum says the financial implications associated with the implementation of this legislation will be included in the 24-25 budget.
No, they won't. That means that's Defence's costs to administer this. What about the costs that they're inflicting on everyone that is now subject to this?
Well, if every researcher in Australia is now going, if I can go to jail if I have a conversation with somebody without getting an approval beforehand, a permit before, I'm going to apply for a permit. So now Defence, the Export Control Office, is going to be swamped with hundreds of thousands of permits, which will take thousands and thousands of bureaucrats to administer, aside from the cost, as you say, Michael, on industry itself.
The funny thing about this is this, you'll hate this because it's a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy quote.
Here we go.
But the company that makes all these terrible robots, Sirius Cybernetics Corporation, its largest and most profitable division is its complaints division. And I think we can see that future for Defence Export Control Office. It's going to become very large and engage with fearful, unhappy people.
Well, I think there is a lot of fearfulness and unhappiness already. Now, it's possible we're all missing the point because we haven't been able to penetrate through the opaqueness of the explanatory memorandum.
Well, I would like there to be an explanatory document that explains the explanatory memorandum. And maybe it could be written in something approaching English that is designed to be understood.
Oh, there you go. There you go, Michael. God, complaining again. But so I did seek the wisdom of the crowd. So I actually went to LinkedIn and posted something there saying, am I missing the point or what is going on here?
Yeah.
And I would have to say, other than one enthusiastic young American who seemed to think, well, we do need security, otherwise we'll all be seduced by Chinese prostitutes and give up all of our secrets. Other than that young man, everybody had serious concerns.
Well, let's hear a few of them.
So, I got a direct message back from an industry insider who says, yes, it's basically integrate with the US or die. And I spoke to many non-AUKUS companies that are being told they are too much of a risk to procure from because of AUKUS.
Oh, well, that's the Tyler's answer then. So at least there's clarity there.
So somebody else wrote, it certainly appears to be very rushed and a week for consultation on something as critical as this is not long enough to understand the true repercussions. Another one, talk about an own goal. This law, if it includes AI and ML, machine learning, would effectively make us beholden to the US and UK, who are actually our main Western competitors, and we would not be able to compete in the global market. Okay, so we're now locked out of the global market for AI and machine learning. So, another one saying, agreed, it's very flawed. The very vague interpretation of covered articles needs to be reconsidered or will restrict everything. I saw this firsthand when I worked in the US Joint Space Staff, that the overregulated articles of space products meant the US lost their competitive market advantage. The US has been unable to rectify that problem. We stand to lose what little we've gained as well. And then a rather pithy one. ITAR, a nightmare shared is a nightmare doubled. And then somebody who was quite honest said, I'm probably being really stupid here, but isn't this all about setting up something like ITAR on steroids? And it's like, I don't think you're being really stupid here, because the explanatory memorandum, in fact, says that.
So look, I absolutely understand if this new tightening of controls around sharing technology and information, and not just products but services, if that was focused on Pillar 1 in AUKUS, the nuclear submarines, that has to happen. There will have to be a deeper, tighter set of security controls around that bubble of nuclear technology.
And everybody agrees with that.
But this is about everything.
Well, you and I, Michael, both worked at ASPI several years ago when a very good young researcher called Alex Josky published a number of pieces exposing the extent to which Australian universities were bringing in graduate students and researchers from China who just happened to be members of the PLA, and Australian researchers had in their labs PLA officers working on things like explosives and a whole bunch of other military technology.
For peaceful purposes, I remember one PhD explosives expert who was being mentored in Australia told his
and at the
supervisor.
time, you wrote a number of things, sort of shedding this information, sharing this information. So we're not naive. We do think there needs to be security awareness. We do believe there needs to be an export control regime. The heads of our various intelligence services have been pointing out in great detail the threat posed particularly by the People's Republic of China. So we're not saying don't have any export control regimes. But it is those 8 deadly sins of where you are regulating absolutely everything regardless of materiality.
Well, and the effect of having, I can hear the counter-argument, well, look, I don't know what you're talking about. All they've got to do is apply for a permit. I'd be very happy to have that Japanese space expert employed in Gilmore Space or somewhere else. Very happy. Just apply for a permit. What's the problem? It reminds me of when I was in the public service and there was a direction from government to reduce the number of public servants, probably to make room for more spending on consultants at the time. But anyway, the head of
I think it was
my
the
department...
more band 3 public servants. We needed to free up some...
Well, that's happened. The head of my department put an edict out saying, all recruitment has to come through me. I will sign off all recruitment. And people said, but we really need to fill some key positions. And he said, I'm not stopping you in recruiting. All you've got to do is get permission from me. Do you know what happened? It stopped recruitment because the process of applying for approval or a permit was so onerous and you were worried about it, you didn't do it. So that is exactly what is going to happen here.
Well, look, I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who are thinking, well, Defence knows what it's doing. We should probably trust them on this important issue. I would simply refer back to our last podcast, Michael, where we talked about an internal review commissioned by the Secretary of the Department of Defence that concluded that it had essentially failed in its basic duty of conducting a proper competition for the selection of the future frigate, and that it had provided very poor advice to the government on pretty much all aspects of that program, and essentially gave itself an F for something that is core defence business. Yes, the Future Frigate project is the second biggest project in defence history, so it's big, but it is core defence business, and by its own admission, Defence admitted it got it completely wrong. My question is why do we think this is any better thought through, why this piece of advice to government recommending this legislation is any better?
Yeah, particularly basic research will show so many people that are credible in the US system see ITAR as a problem for their own national security and their own innovation. And to me, it's a driver that created the need for AUKUS Pillar 2. So this is a recipe for continued failure in getting new entrants supplying our militaries with technologies and systems from the civilian world, and it's going to make people turn away from wanting to work in the defence sector at a time when we want to bring new entrants into it.
So the only question remaining for me is, if it's so bad, why are we doing it? And it does seem to me that it is a kind of quid pro quo. So the US is saying, well, you can enter our system and come inside the US tent and be treated the same as the US. The quid pro quo is you cut yourselves off to everybody else. And if that is actually what is going on, it is not, I think, a gesture of good faith from the United States that AUKUS is going to work well in Australia's interests.
No, and I really think there's a deep failure of imagination here to think about the actual purpose of what we're doing. And I can almost see the superficial triumphalism of saying, see, we're in ITARs now. And I think that would be a moment to see damage to our national interests and also to the alliance. So this needs to be changed. It needs to be comprehensively rethought from the ground up. And again, the people that should be involved in this thinking are not the people in the Defence Department. The people that need to be listened to here in co-designing are the people in some of the world's most successful tech companies here in the US and UK who do not want to touch working with defence with a barge pole because of these very approaches.
Well, I think this is something we definitely need to keep tracking. We'll put on links on our webpage to Colin Clark's article that quotes both Bill Greenwald and Chenapati Jagadish. We'll put in a link to the legislation itself and the explanatory memorandum so people can look at it. According to Defence, submissions closed today. I suspect, however, if people wanted to submit something, they'll probably keep taking them for a while.
Well, I think they'll need a permit.
They may need a permit to make a submission, we'll see. So I would urge people to actually do a bit of research on this because it has the potential to, I think, fundamentally damage our defence industry for a very, very long time to come. Actually, what we've seen from the US is once you go down this path, you can't get off it. And that could be what we're doing to ourselves.
Yes. All right. Well, thanks, Marcus. Well, let's bring this emergency episode to a close.